And nothing like, oh, this is great, you didn't use any drugs. Oh, they just said, well, you announced that, you have released one. As an aside, just cast aside. And I felt bad about this.
What would be the implications of shutting your borders against Nigeria and countries shutting the borders against other countries? Because the WHO says we still have 6 months to go to deal with Ebola in West Africa. That's quite a long time, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Well, but you see, if you adopt a beggar my neighbor policy, which is Ebola, Nigerian problem, Ebola, West African problem, therefore, no planes from West Africa, no this, no that, fine. When next you suffer your own swine flu, whatever it is, then, we say that's a Chinese problem. All Chinese, time to start going back home. We don't want you to come back here. That doesn't solve the problem. What Ebola and the swine flu and the Nile virus, whatever it is, what they are teaching us is that the world is a global village. This is not 1700. This is not 1500 anymore. Every day, millions of people in this world travel. They move across borders. Therefore, we must design a global medical health system so that with, if you like, what will you call it, alarm spots, so that the moment something happens, you don't say that's a Chinese problem. You say, this is a world problem. Let's tackle it.
And it seems that, these West African countries have the same attitude to security. Take, for instance, Boko Haram. It took the French government to invite Nigeria's francophone neighbors before they made a commitment, to fighting Boko Haram in West Africa.
You are right, but I blame Nigeria for that. I was reading somewhere today, I don't know how true it is, but I was reading something today that the last government to actually equip the military massively was the Shagari government. And it's just now that this present government has practically declared an emergency in terms of equipment of the army. Now, that's disgraceful. If that is true, that is very disgraceful. We should never have allowed that to happen. Nigerian security apparatus, police, military, navy, cannot garrison Nigeria. Therefore, the Boko Haram can decide to hit this village. As you are rushing your troops there, they pull out, then they go and hit you somewhere else. And then you pull the troops and you are rushing after them again. So they have the advantage. A guerrilla war, because this is really more like guerrilla warfare. A guerrilla movement has the advantage of where to hit. You can only react. So what I would expect the government to do, frankly, is to do what we did at the beginning of the Civil War. You just admit you don't have enough men under arms, and you're going for massive recruitment.
When the Chibok girls were abducted, about a month later, the US, UK, and France promised to send in experts to help us find the girls. They came in with some equipment, drones and so on. So we could say they probably have some information on where the girls are or on Boko Haram's activities on the continent, but it doesn't seem like they want to share. Would you say the West has been fair to Nigeria and the rest of Africa?
I blame the Nigerian government, not the present administration. Let me make that very clear. If it is true, what I said earlier on, that the military had not been well provisioned in terms of equipment and what have you, since the days of Shagari, then there are a lot of former heads of states who should feel ashamed of themselves in this country. Why ask for American drones? If my memory serves me very well, about 4 years ago, there was all this mess in the media where somebody had complained that he got the contract to supply drones to Nigeria, and it was shortchanged. And I understand that these drones were bought and that they are lying in the Benin airport. Useless. Useless. Did anybody get punished for that? No. If I were the National Assembly, this is the time for your Committee on Defense Spending to even now ask, okay, we want to know how the money has been spent since 1999, defense money. Where are the equipments that are supposed to be bought? So why should the Americans help you with their drones when you went to buy useless, Tokumbo drones that you cannot even use? Why? So, I read somewhere that the Americans came in and that the defense structure that they found on the ground, they just couldn't work with it.
And it would seem like Boko Haram and the IS militants and the Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, these groups first started out as Islamist groups, religious groups, and then they became terror groups. We've been asking, what do they want? They've set up a caliphate in northern Iraq. 2 weeks ago, Boko Haram announced it had set up a caliphate in Goza. Do you negotiate with terrorists? Because right now we're claiming we don't know what they want, but do you negotiate with them, or do you go all out with force on them?
You cannot negotiate with terror groups. You have to go all out and defeat them. Now, that's the easiest part. The more difficult part is, how do you separate terror groups from religious groups with legitimate aspirations? One of the things that we should get clear in our minds is there is an Islamic resurgence in the world who are looking back to the days of the caliphate, when there was an Islamic renaissance, achievements in science, achievement in the arts, and what have you. They believe that it was the might and force of Western civilization, which they equate with Christian civilization, that actually destroyed that Islamic empire. And now that there is oil resources from Saudi Arabia, from the Gulf states, they want Islam to now occupy a space in the sun. They want a resurgence of that Islamic renaissance, of the caliphate. So you cannot negotiate with the terror organizations, whether it's called Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, now Islamic State. You can't. And I'm afraid that, we are not being very truthful, because part of this problem and the contribution of Saudi Arabia to this problem is not being acknowledged, even though people know that Saudi Arabia, the Salafists, it grew up in Saudi Arabia and it was exported. And it's almost like the religious arm of Al-Qaeda. Now, nobody is going after Saudi Arabia. Nobody is calling that kingdom, where most of the funding originally came from, nobody is calling it to order. The Americans made a mistake. Saddam Hussein in Iraq had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. And yet you went after him. You destabilized his country. And yet most of those who flew those planes into the World Trade Center came from Saudi Arabia. You did nothing to Saudi Arabia.
Months before IS militants took up, much of northern Iraq and Syria, there were discussions on whether the US and the West should equip rebels in Syria to fight against the Assad government. And now these groups have come together and they're now a stronger terror group, troubling not just the Assad government, but also troubling Iraq. How do you think the US government should approach what's going on in Syria and in Iraq and how they should approach the IS militants, because he either has to cooperate with Bashar al-Assad to defeat the Islamist militants. It seems like the only way now.
I wouldn't want to be in Obama's shoes right now, because so much has been fractionalized and fragmented in the Middle East and in Syria. But if I were to give him my views from this safe distance, if you can call being caught between Ebola and Boko Haram safe, I will say the main enemy now is not the president of Syria, is the Islamic State. Is that organization. That is the enemy now. And even though you may dislike the president of, what's his name again? Bashar al-Assad. You may dislike him. And even though you may wish that deep in your heart, you will support the pro-democracy groups who themselves cannot even follow the history of the pro-democracy group. It's like every 90 days, they have to change who they think should be prime minister, who should command the army. They can't get their act together. I will team up with Bashar al-Assad right now to defeat the Islamic State, which has declared that it knows no boundary. For Syria, then Iraq. Where is it going to? Turkey? And then to where? And even the king of Saudi Arabia is now saying that if you don't deal with this Islamic State, they're going to be in Europe next, and then in the United States after. So, to me, then the issue should be clear. You go after the Islamic State.
Professor, thank you so much for speaking with us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
And that's the program this week. Thank you for watching. Always looking forward to your comments. The addresses are showing right now on your screen. I am Amarachi Ubana. I'll see you next time.